thank you all for coming. Is that decent? Okay, thank you. We're about to start, and I'm not going to take up too much time talking. For all of you who are here, thank you so very much. By a show of hands, how many of you did I hound down to come here? Good. Then my job is, I did a good job then. So this is how it's going to work. We're going to start right now. It's probably going to be about roughly an hour and some change lecture. Possibly, maybe more, give or take.
When you start going like this.
When I start going like this, it's over, and then the Q&A starts, and then there's going to be food afterwards. So let's begin.
Okay. Good evening. Welcome, everybody. First, I want to thank the MSA and Abraham Shawish for inviting me up here. It's my first time in Oswego, and I'm really glad to see the campus and what's going on here. I'm hoping that my kids will choose one of your SUNY schools, since I'm a New Yorker. I want to talk to you tonight. Thank you for coming to this event on this very difficult and emotional topic that has been so fraught with violence and conflict. I want to do kind of I'm not really sure who you are and what you know and what the mix is here. But what I'm going to do is kind of a crash course in Israel-Palestine. And I have for you a basic breakdown, my 8 sort of chapters, we might say, of what we're going to do tonight. I'm going to explain some of that in a moment, and go through the sort of history up till the present time. And given the size, you know, I'm open to the idea of questions even while I'm talking, if it doesn't get too out of hand, right? We'll see how it goes. I'd like to get through it, and because we start with old stuff and then go to more recent stuff. Okay, let me first just tell you a little bit about myself, right, and who I am and how I come to this whole project. All right, if you didn't figure it out, Avram Bornstein, I'm Jewish. I grew up in Miami until I was 17, 18, and then went to college and left Miami. And I spent a lot of time in my youth. I came to this topic really through a Jewish education, through the synagogue, and through visiting Israel as a kid. And as a little kid, and then as a high school student going over on a high school program for a semester there. And then I went back when I was in my junior year of college to Hatzofim, to Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and that was 1988. And that was the first year of the Intifada, the first Intifada. It started December of 87, and before it was a year old, I found myself in Jerusalem. I was already an anthropology major in college, and had some anthropological experience, so had new eyes coming to Jerusalem that year. And through a series of really accidents, I found myself in the occupied territories in the West Bank, visiting in a refugee camp that in the first few weeks I was there that year. And that whole year really was a completely new experience for me. I spoke Hebrew pretty well at that point, at about 20, and by the end of that year, my spoken Arabic was about on par with my spoken Hebrew. And when I finished in the 90s, I went on to graduate school studying anthropology and made the West Bank and the occupation and really the work under the occupation and daily life the focus of my studies. So I came to this in many ways through an education about Israel, and then have spent the last 20 years, sometimes in Israel, but largely hanging out with Palestinians, doing field work a lot in the 90s, all through the 90s, continued into this century, 2000s. I got married and had a kid in 2003, so I made my last trip to the West Bank in 2004 with a 10-month-old, and had another kid, so I haven't been back since 2004. It's a little tough traveling around with little kids under the occupation. So I'm hoping I'll be back soon, but I've been there about 4 visits since this last Intifada. I'll explain all about that. It's been about 5 years now since I've been there. I mean, I'm still in touch with people I lived with, but that's how it's why I'm standing here right now in front of you to tell you about Israel-Palestine, okay? All right, so by way of introduction, this is a general map of the Eastern Mediterranean, and right in the center of it, I guess I have a pointer. We'll see how it works. Can you see that? I can't see it. There it is, right? Okay, right there, the yellow, Israel 48. I'll explain what I mean by 48, and the occupied territories in gray, and other countries that you recognize often in the news: Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Saudi, Egypt, okay? Tonight we're going to talk about, I have this broken down into 8 parts. The first one I call theory, because, I mean, after all, I'm an anthropologist, so, and a professor at City University of New York. In New York, I teach at the Graduate Center Anthropology in the John Jay College. And I know, and you should know, that every history is kind of selective, right? You can't tell everything that happened. You select facts, right, according to the way you theorize it. And you can either be clear on how you theorize it or not clear, and it can be sort of underneath everything. So I want to explain to you what I think is my theory. I'll come to that first. And then we sort of break it down into some chronology, sort of how things evolve. And we'll talk about, very briefly, ancient history. I could spend a whole semester on this or more, but we'll do it very quickly. And then the modern partition, 20th century, nationalist movements, explaining that partition and the development of both the Jewish nationalist movement called Zionism and Palestinian nationalism. And there's a lot of diversity within each movement. And then the occupation of 67 and the Palestinian Authority starting in 94, 93, 94, the Al-Aqsa Intifada of 2000 up till now, and sort of the political questions that we're sitting at. What's going on right now on the two sides, and where might we go forward? Okay? So, to start with, okay, why the conflict? All right, this is sort of the theory part, right? There's a lot of things. If you watch the news, people talk about a lot of reasons that this conflict. You hear a lot of journalists, talking about ancient religious conflicts. That is, for me, that's wrong, right? Religion certainly is brought into the conflict, right? It's certainly used in the conflict. But I do not theorize that is really the source of the conflict. And that there's a lot of facts I could bring to you, but we could also look at water or oil, a struggle over these factors, and certainly those are issues in the Middle East, but I don't think those are at the heart of this conflict. And some say modernity, people fearing democracy, things like that. I think that's way out in left field. It really has very little basis in the current conflict, what's going on. The thing that I think is critical is nationalism, right? That nationalism is sort of the way we can understand what's going on here. That we really have two nationalisms, two nationalist projects competing over one territory. And when I say nationalism, I've given you a definition, right? Different things can be defined in different ways, but nationalism as the modern ideology that a particular people should have their own territorially sovereign state. Now, I'm not going to get into a big political theory lecture about, the Treaty of Westphalia and the beginning of modern states and territorial sovereignty, but I will tell you that it's modern, and the two nationalisms we're dealing with are Zionism, which is Jewish nationalism, which is the ideological basis of Israel, and Palestinian nationalism, which has no state at this time. There's a Palestinian Authority, but it's not a territorial sovereign state. But it is the goal of the Palestinian nationalist movement to create a territorial sovereign state, right? A state for a people. How do we define a people? Well, that can have some gray areas to it. And there's been a lot of effort to make people into a certain type of people, to make the French nation out of many different peoples, for example, to pick one, to make the American people. You can see how complicated that concept would be. Who are the American people, right? And here it can be equally complicated, but we'll see how these ideas emerge. One thing that I would say about nationalism